Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. It's Dave, or as you know me, Hero in his head, and after a small hiatus, I have returned to bring you guys more wondrous gaming content. Now recently, I haven't made a ton of videos because I haven't really been able to game too much. The economy is shite, as many of you guys know, and I've had to put YouTube on the side in order to provide for my family and, pay my bills. And honestly, aside from that, I've just been creatively drained whenever I do manage to get the time. However, while I was perusing Steam the other day, I did realize that there was an absolute mess of Star Wars games on sale. And I am a huge Star Wars fan, having read a ton of the comics, both canon and Legends material, as well as following a lot of the larger Star Wars YouTubers like Star Wars Theory, The Stupendous Wave, and Star Wars Comics, formerly known as Bessie, love you my guy. And I happened to have some shekels in my Steam wallet from a recent return that I done, so I decided to pick up a couple of them. Not some of the, lesser known ones, but just, the classics. KOTOR's 1 and 2, Force Unleashed 1 and 2, some of the newer ones like Fallen Order, and the recent iteration of Battlefront 2, which I'd actually maxed on Xbox, but I decided to start over on PC because, better. Now, as I'm sure many of you guys have guessed by the title, I'm not actually particularly satisfied with any of the games that I purchased. I don't regret purchasing them, and I've actually played them to death both now and before, and I love them like crazy. It's just they don't hit that particular itch for me when it comes to Star Wars like they used to, and it honestly made me realize something. And that's that my ideal Star Wars game does not exist. Now, there are a lot of attempts to make the perfect Star Wars game, and they've come really close, but the issue is that the features that I want are not in one singular game. In fact, they're actually spread across multiple games, both in Star Wars and out of Star Wars, many of the Star Wars ones having developed very devout fandoms, and you know which ones you are. And then other ones being developed by some of the largest and most powerful giants in the gaming industry who still managed to screw them up. And, well, for instance, Battlefront 2 has come a long way since it first released, and it is very close to the game that we had hoped for originally. It took until the last update of the game to finally get it to the point that it was, good, and it kind of left me blue-balled by the whole experience, by the end product. And that leads to my next point, which is, why is it so damn hard to make a great Star Wars game that gives you the feeling and the suspense that you got when you were playing Fallen Order? One that makes you feel as powerful as you do in Force Unleashed and has a rich and driven story like that of KOTOR's 1 and 2. And speaking of KOTOR's, why were they the last real attempt to make a single-player Star Wars RPG? I mean, there was the year and a half I spent playing the MMORPG, The Old Republic, but that was still in itself an MMO and will never meet the standards that I expect from a full-fledged RPG, but that is, of course, my own opinion, so moving on from that. The answer to me seems to be a combination of issues regarding time and money and then branding. And I know that last one may be a bit confusing, but bear with me because I'll explain. Now, in regards to time and money, we have the issues of balancing those things. Small companies tend to have more time but not enough money to make a stellar big-budget game. It's not a nail in the coffin by any means, but it's not outside the realm of reality to say that more money means more potential as a game. Note, I said potential, as we both know, small games made by indie companies that have done extremely well, and AAA companies that have screwed the pooch despite having the funds, and that is where time becomes a problem. As many of you guys know, I'm an avid fan of Kenshi by Lo-Fi Games. In fact, it's basically carrying my channel at this point. Kenshi was made by a very small company, originally comprised of a single person, but has obviously now expanded. Chris Hunt, who founded and created the company and the game, worked for over a decade to create what is one of the most stellar sandbox-based RPGs that I have ever seen. And this was because he took the time to create a product worth playing without worry of things like time constraints due to contracts with publishers. Larger, big AAA companies are usually under the thumb of their parent company or the publishers based on the contract they signed. Now, I'm not going to get into the debate on whether developers need to better advocate for their game with publishers and all the behind-the-scenes nonsense, because that would take way too much time and I'd lose my overall point. But basically, larger companies have more money, but will rush the product to meet deadlines with publishers, and what we end up getting is products that lack polish. They lack love for the genre, source material, and the story as a whole, and generally are missing features. Larger companies seem to care less about the product in favor of maximizing profits through things like serialization, following current trends, which is why we had 5 years of battle royales despite them all being the same and terrible, and I will not apologize for that. What we need is a healthy balance. A company that is willing to put the time and the money in to make the perfect Star Wars game. A game that myself and many others have envisioned for a very, very long time. And luckily now that EA and Disney do not hold the exclusive rights to make games based on the franchise, we may see something truly amazing coming in the near future from a smaller developer or a large AAA company that wants to put the time in. Now, the other issue that I think is a big factor would be brand recognition. Now, Star Wars is a household name, there is no doubt of that. Even people who know nothing about it know what it is, and that's because of the wide array of mediums as well as the massive love and appreciation for the source material that has been typically had throughout the years, until recently. It has spanned hundreds, if not thousands of comics, extended universes, dozens of movies, TV shows, and has been a cultural icon for 44 years as of this video's release. And because of that, oftentimes we see developers attempt to ride that fame by jamming in tons of unneeded references, cameos, homages, and everything else to get close to the quote, iconic, instead of making something that stands on its own. I'm not saying those are bad things, but as a player, I don't want a shitty title with 7 hours of gameplay, but at least I got to see Darth Vader a couple times and they referenced Yoda. What I'm trying to say is that you can't just ram the familiar down our faces and call it a good game on that alone. It needs substance. KOTOR was a perfect example of how to fix this. They set the game a few thousand years prior to the movie so that we have no clear cameos or branding rammed down our throat for nostalgia, and instead we have a familiar setting, one that has its own rules, its own merits, and its own lore that only externally connects with a Dark Horse comic from the 90s, and is mostly not connected to the main story in any apparent way beyond also being in the Star Wars universe. Instead, it ended up feeding the lore of the universe and helped to create a compelling, choice-based, story-driven narrative that actually had consequences, because, let's face it, we all knew Starkiller was not going to beat Darth Vader because Vader makes it to Episode 4. And we all knew and know that Cal Kestis isn't going to beat the Empire or rebuild the Jedi because they still exist in Episode 4 and the Jedi don't. Do you guys see what I'm saying? It's really hard to feel like everything you're doing matters when you know how the story is going to end and the character you're playing is not even going to be there. I mean, it's not a deal breaker by any means. Fallen Order is still a solid game and I loved Force Unleashed beyond words. But these kind of things detract from the sense of urgency and choice in all of these games because they don't really matter. In the case of KOTOR's 1 and 2, they actually did the exact opposite. They introduced an entirely new section of the lore that was only found in that Dark Horse comic I mentioned, Tales of the Jedi. And then they took that and connected it to the original era of Star Wars and expanded the universe, resulting in its continued expansions across multiple mediums following the Old Republic era specifically, all because they chose to create a story that was driven by choice. It existed outside the time's current continuity, where your choices would actually matter in the overall story. So, now that I have addressed two of the larger issues in my opinion, it may be time to explain my idea of the perfect Star Wars game, and yes, it is an RPG, and in all honesty, if we're going to do it, there's really two options for me on how. And it should be noted that both of these are fully open-world, combat-based RPGs. Now, the first idea that I've drummed up would have to be set in the far future. My thought is that by introducing a clear and concise future, maybe 1, 2, 3,000 years after Episode 9, we would end up seeing a massive spike in lore for the events between Episodes 9 and this hypothetical game, just like we saw with KOTOR. Obviously, this would not be the prime focus of the game, but it would, be pretty beneficial. I think your character would likely be the typical underdog, maybe give us origin story sequences similar to that we saw in Dragon Age Origins. You'd learn about your selected class as you progress through the origin of maybe a smuggler, a soldier, a Jedi, a Sith, a slave, all the unique starts. You'd have a deep story with choices of morality, with weighted consequences, multiple endings, and stylized combat with multiple classes of weaponry and unique synchronized animations for that sweet sound of sabers clashing, and then obviously abilities to complement them. Ideally, you would be able to approach any scenario or objective from multiple angles to suit different playstyles. If you wanted to make a brute force wielder, maybe you just blast through the wall and slam foes against the ground, while maybe a stealthy mercenary might create distractions, move through the shadows, and utilize an array of gadgets and tech to assist in the mission's completion, but either way you have the choice to do those things. You'd have the choice to prevent a massive galactic catastrophe, or maybe become something even worse as you descend into the dark side. Hold nothing back in terms of abilities. I want to see things like light, force choking, force healing, push, pull, maybe Windu's Shatterpoint ability, life drains, hand grenades, acrobatics and jetpacks, and so much more. And I would want the abilities to be animated to perfection. None of that little spark shit. I want some good sparks flying from my fingers, boys. And I want companions, not, a ton, maybe like 5 to 10 options with stories, side missions, and character arcs that you can influence and change who they are as the story progresses and watch them grow in real time. I want combat that makes you feel like The Force Unleashed did with the polish and strategy and pacing that I got in Fallen Order. And a good expanse of the galaxy with both worlds familiar and new with the level of detail we saw in the level design for Battlefront 2, because let's be honest, have you seen those maps? Kashyyyk? My god. I want skill trees and clear progression in your strengths. I don't want the end game to be easy, but I also want to know I've made progress, and my character, who at one point struggled to fight maybe a training dummy, can now rip through a battalion as they've become a seasoned veteran and more experienced in their skills. I want the world to change as my character moves and grows, and I want to see those changes in future options of the game. Now, on to the second option that I had come up with, and honestly, this is my more favorite of the two. And I know I'm going to get called a hypocrite because of what I had just got done talking about, but I would be satisfied with this game if it was set between episodes 3 and 4, just like Force Unleashed and Fallen Order, provided that we change the game type and the story a bit. And that's the reason it's not going to meet the criteria of choices don't matter and familiar doesn't always mean good. And this is because you won't be a lone, newly introduced hero saving the galaxy from the Empire, or attempting it anyway. Instead, you'd play as Vader himself. And while you know how his story ends, you go into the game as the pre-established villain. You aren't the newly risen hero, you're the bad guy, and what you do does matter, because it's the choices in your journey that end up taking him to the end of Episode 6. And in this game, we would be able to explore the time gap between Episodes 3 and 4 as Vader, ideally borrowing concepts of open-world tracking and preparing for combat that we saw in titles like The Witcher 3. Vader would have to utilize interrogation, meditation, Imperial informants, and all other manners at his disposal to hunt down and eliminate the remaining Jedi after Order 66. Maybe even open the game during Order 66 and then be present as Vader enters his new life as a Sith Lord. You could even follow up the introduction to combat that Order 66 would give you on a tutorial on tracking and interrogation when Vader is hunting down a taker of the Bearish Vow to get his new lightsaber as he did in the comics. And then we would get a chance to understand what it was like to be the infamous Jedi killer himself. Ideally, combat would be a healthy mix of Force Unleashed in the sense that you'd feel like the greatest Jedi killer in history, but without being nearly as easy as Force Unleashed was. More like the Star Wars equivalent of The Witcher, with aspects about how it felt to be Vader in Battlefront 2 in that imposing way that he moves and feels. Less rolling, more blocking and force action, if that makes any sense. I don't know, maybe I'm alone in the idea of playing as Vader himself and hunting Jedi in an open world game with stunning terrain and maps paired with Witcher-esque gameplay, but in the Star Wars medium, that works for me, my guy. It works very well, and it'd be fire. It'd be fire. But that is just my own opinion, and if you guys have a different one or you even agree, please let me know in the comment section down below. If you like this kind of more laid-back commentary content where I just kind of talk about something randomly that popped in my head that's gaming related while I work on bigger projects and more time-consuming projects, please let me know, as I'd love your opinions, and if you could drop a like and subscribe, I'd appreciate it a ton. But this has been Hero in His Head, and I will see you all real soon.